The Hegemony of Advanced Species had achieved something remarkable in the annals of galactic civilization. They had successfully bureaucratized the entire known universe into a state of perpetual mind-numbing peace. It was the kind of achievement that looked impressive on official reports and made for excellent talking points at diplomatic galas, right up until someone pointed out that their definition of advanced apparently included an alarming tendency to mistake paperwork for progress. From their gleaming administrative complexes scattered across 17 star systems, the hegemony's finest minds had spent the better part of 3 centuries cataloging, categorizing, and ultimately dismissing every species that didn't meet their rather particular standards for civilization. The humans, bless their primitive little hearts, had been filed under quaint bipedal mammals with delusions of competence for the past 847 years. It was a classification that had served everyone quite well, particularly the humans, who had been blissfully unaware that their entire spacefaring civilization was considered roughly equivalent to a child's science project by the rest of the galaxy. The decision to terminate the human starfaring scout initiative came down, as most monumentally stupid decisions do, during a perfectly routine administrative review on a perfectly unremarkable Tuesday. The Hegemony's Subcommittee for the Management of Primitive Species Outreach Programs had gathered in Conference Room 7 Alpha Delta Boring, armed with steaming cups of synthetic caffeine analogs and the kind of confidence that only comes from never having been spectacularly wrong about anything important. The human scouting program has outlived its usefulness, declared Undersecretary Vexton, a being whose species had evolved past the need for facial expressions, but somehow retained the ability to radiate smug satisfaction through their bioluminescent head tentacles. 847 years of charity work is quite enough. They've mapped 14% of their local star cluster, established 43 colonies that barely qualify as agricultural settlements, and filed approximately 2.7 million reports that consist primarily of variations on found and other rock. Still no signs of intelligent life. The assembled committee members flickered their tentacles, raised their manipulator appendages, and generally indicated agreement in whatever manner their evolutionary lottery tickets had provided. The Zephyrians pulsed pale blue with amusement. The morphic collective rippled through several geometric configurations that translated roughly to, "How adorable." The crystalline hierarchs chimed in harmonious frequencies that somehow managed to sound condescending. Their military capabilities remain laughably primitive, added Director Niall Seth, whose species had achieved galactic dominance through a combination of advanced technology and an evolutionary predisposition towards stating the obvious. Their largest vessels are barely capable of sustained interstellar flight. Their weapon systems couldn't penetrate the shielding on our maintenance drones. They still use ballistic projectiles for ground combat, which is rather like bringing pointed sticks to a photon beam fight. The Hegemony's Military Assessment Division had been particularly thorough in their evaluation of human combat potential. The files, which ran to several thousand pages of dense technical analysis, could be summarized quite succinctly. Humans were too emotional to wage effective war, too individualistic to maintain proper military discipline, and too chaotically unpredictable to pose any meaningful threat to established galactic order. Their greatest military achievement to date appeared to be the successful colonization of 12 star systems without accidentally destroying any of them, which the assessors noted was actually quite impressive for a species that had only recently figured out faster-than-light travel. The vote was unanimous, filed in triplicate, and processed through the proper channels with the kind of efficiency that only comes from having absolutely no idea what you're actually voting on. The recall orders were transmitted to the last remaining human scout vessel, the UES Persistent Question, on a Thursday. The ship's captain, a weathered woman whose personnel file listed her primary qualifications as stubborn beyond reason, and has successfully avoided court-martial for 37 consecutive years, received the transmission with the kind of stoic resignation that had become standard operating procedure for dealing with galactic bureaucracy. "Well, crew," she announced over the ship's communication system, her voice carrying the particular tone that military personnel reserve for announcing that someone else has made a decision that everyone present is going to regret. "It seems our services are no longer required. The Hegemony has decided we're not worth the paperwork anymore." The Persistent Questions crew took the news with characteristic human grace, which is to say they immediately began placing bets on how long it would take for the galaxy to realize it had made a mistake. The smart money, according to the ship's engineer, was on sooner than they think. but not soon enough to matter. As the last human scout ship turned toward home, its sensors dutifully recorded the positions of 17 previously unknown star systems, 43 potentially habitable worlds, and one particularly interesting debris field that seemed to contain the remains of a civilization that had also been dismissed as primitive by someone long ago. The captain made sure to include all of this information in her final report, which she filed under Things You Probably Should Have Paid Attention To, and transmitted with the kind of professional courtesy that barely concealed a profound understanding of exactly how expensive lessons in humility tend to be. The 6 months following the termination of the Human Starfaring Scout Initiative were, by all official accounts, a resounding success for galactic civilization. Trade routes hummed along with the predictable efficiency of well-oiled machinery. Diplomatic incidents decreased by a statistically significant margin. Border disputes were resolved through proper channels without a single report of humans accidentally wandering into restricted space and asking uncomfortable questions about why certain star systems were marked as geologic survey zones, when they clearly contained the remains of strip-mined worlds. The Hegemony's Department of Unnecessary Complications reported their lowest workload in centuries. The Subcommittee for Managing Primitive Species Outreach Programs had been reassigned to more pressing matters, such as standardizing the font sizes used in interdepartmental memoranda and establishing a task force to determine whether the office plants in Sector 7 were receiving adequate artificial sunlight. It was the kind of bureaucratic paradise that made administrators weep tears of pure crystalline joy. The only thing that should have concerned anyone paying attention was how perfectly suspiciously, ominously quiet everything had become. But the hegemony had evolved far beyond such primitive concerns as pattern recognition when it came to actual threats. They had algorithms for that sort of thing, and the algorithms were quite certain that humans posed roughly the same level of strategic concern as a mildly irritating species of space fungus. The first anomalous readings appeared on Deep Space Monitoring Station, Omega 77. Why are we still numbering these things during the night shift? Which was staffed by the kind of beings who had drawn the cosmic equivalent of the short straw in terms of career advancement. Senior Technician Hikeswell, whose species had developed the ability to perceive 17 different spectrums of electromagnetic radiation, but had somehow failed to evolve common sense, stared at the sensor display with the particular expression that technical personnel reserve for equipment that's obviously malfunctioning in impossible ways. "That can't be right," Hikeswell muttered, adjusting the sensors for the 14th time in the past hour. The readings showed massive energy signatures moving through the galactic rim at velocities that violated several fundamental laws of physics, and at least 3 major principles of common sense. The energy patterns were consistent with faster-than-light drives, but the power output suggested vessels of a size that should have been visible to the naked eye from 3 star systems away. The station's artificial intelligence, a Class 7 computational matrix with all the personality of a particularly pedantic filing cabinet, helpfully chimed in with its assessment: probability of sensor malfunction, 97.4%, probability of natural phenomenon, 2.5%, probability of unknown technological signature, 0.1%. Recommended action: submit maintenance request and continue monitoring. Because nothing said advanced civilization quite like having your most sophisticated monitoring equipment programmed to assume that anything it couldn't explain was probably broken. The maintenance request was duly filed, processed through 17 different administrative layers, and eventually assigned to a repair team, whose earliest available appointment was in 6. The energy signatures continued to appear with increasing frequency, forming patterns that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone who had spent time studying human military history, particularly the chapters dealing with fleet formations and strategic deployment patterns. Unfortunately, the hegemony's xenobiological experts had spent most of their time studying human recreational activities and social customs, which had led them to conclude that any species that voluntarily participated in activities called extreme sports was clearly too impulsive to engage in long-term strategic planning. The academic community was particularly confident in their assessment of human limitations. Caxtory, the galaxy's leading expert in primitive species psychology, had recently published a paper titled The Emotional Volatility Hypothesis, Why Humans Will Never Develop Advanced Military Technology. The paper, which had been peer-reviewed by 17 distinguished colleagues and published in the prestigious Journal of Xenobiological Assumptions, presented compelling evidence that human emotional instability made them fundamentally incapable of the kind of sustained, methodical effort required for major technological breakthroughs. Consider their historical patterns. Dr. Kekstory had written with the kind of academic confidence that comes from never having been personally contradicted by empirical evidence. Humans consistently abandon long-term projects in favor of immediate gratification. They wage wars over concepts as abstract as freedom and dignity, rather than practical concerns like resource allocation. They actually form emotional attachments to their military equipment and give their weapons personal names. This is not the behavior of a species capable of developing coherent strategic doctrine, much less advanced weapons technology. The paper had won 3 academic awards and had been cited in over 400 subsequent studies, all of which reached similar conclusions about human predictability and limitation. The fact that none of these studies had been updated to account for human behavior in the 8 centuries since first contact was considered irrelevant, since primitive species were assumed to evolve at roughly the same pace as geological formation. Meanwhile, Outer Rim colonies began experiencing what the Hegemony's Colonial Administration Bureau classified as routine communication interruption. The first few instances were attributed to solar storm activity, despite the inconvenient fact that none of the affected systems were experiencing unusual stellar phenomena. When 12 colonies in the Centauri expansion zone went silent over the course of a single week, the Bureau's analysis team concluded that they were witnessing an unprecedented cascade failure of communication equipment, possibly due to a manufacturing defect in the quantum entanglement transceiver. The alternative explanation, that someone was systematically neutralizing communication networks with surgical precision, was never seriously considered, because it would have required expecting that humans had somehow developed the technological capability to locate and disable quantum communication nodes, without triggering any of the automated defense systems that protected them. The Hegemony's military strategists had calculated that such an operation would require at least Class II stealth technology, quantum-level sensor networks, and tactical coordination capabilities that were at least 2 centuries beyond anything in the human technological repertoire. They had performed these calculations with meticulous precision, cross-referenced them against multiple databases, and peer-reviewed them through the proper academic channels. The mathematics were unassailable, the logic was flawless, and the conclusions were absolutely categorically and catastrophically wrong. But mathematics, as it turns out, has a peculiar relationship with reality, when the underlying assumptions are based on data that's 8 centuries out of date and was never particularly accurate to begin with. The Hegemony's strategic assessments were masterpieces of analytical rigor applied to fundamentally flawed premises, which made them roughly as useful as detailed weather predictions for planets that had been destroyed by their own stars. As the communication blackouts spread outward from the galactic rim in a pattern that was clearly deliberate to anyone willing to acknowledge what they were seeing, the Hegemony's crisis management protocols activated with the smooth efficiency of a well-rehearsed bureaucratic dance. Emergency committees were formed, subcommittees were established to support the committees, and task forces were created to coordinate between the subcommittees. Reports were filed, analyses were conducted, and recommendations were made with the kind of thorough professionalism that had made the Hegemony the envy of civilizations across 17 star systems. None of which changed the fact that something was moving through their territory with the kind of systematic precision that suggested very advanced technology in the hands of someone who had spent a considerable amount of time learning exactly where all the important things were located. The silence from the outer rim was becoming deafening, but the Hegemony had developed the institutional equivalent of selective hearing when it came to sounds that didn't fit their comfortable assumptions about how the universe was supposed to work. The first sighting occurred at 0347 hours, Galactic Standard Time, when the Hegemony's outer perimeter defense platform, Delta 9, detected what its sensors initially classified as approximately 47,000 objects of unusual configuration approaching from Vector 77 Mark 12 at impossible velocities. The platform's artificial intelligence spent exactly 4.7 seconds running diagnostic checks on its sensor arrays before reaching the inevitable conclusion that its equipment had suffered a catastrophic malfunction, because the alternative would require accepting that someone had assembled a fleet that shouldn't exist using technology that couldn't work, and was deploying it with tactical precision that violated everything the hegemony knew about human military capabilities. Unfortunately for the hegemony's peace of mind, the sensors were working perfectly. The fleet that emerged from hyperspace at the edge of hegemony territory was a masterpiece of engineering that rewrote the laws of physics through the simple expedient of ignoring them entirely. The vessels were unmistakably human in origin. Their angular, pragmatic design philosophy bore the distinctive hallmarks of a species that had learned to build things under the assumption that someone was eventually going to try to break them. But these weren't the crude, barely functional scout ships that the hegemony had been politely tolerating for the past 8 centuries. These were warships that looked like someone had taken human military doctrine, fed it through a technological accelerator, and asked it to express its deepest, most violent fantasies in the language of applied physics. The lead vessels were dreadnoughts that measured roughly 3 kilometers from bow to stern and bristled with weapon systems that the hegemony's tactical analysis computers couldn't even categorize properly. The energy signatures suggested power plants that were operating on principles that wouldn't be discovered by hegemony science for another 2 centuries. Assuming they ever figured out how to ask the right questions. The hull configurations incorporated stealth technology that made the ship simultaneously invisible to conventional sensors and blindingly obvious to anyone who understood what they were looking at. Which was the kind of technological paradox that human engineers apparently considered a fun weekend project. Flanking the dreadnoughts were cruisers that moved through space with the fluid grace of predators that had evolved in an environment where being slow meant being extinct. Their weapon arrays were smaller than those of the capital ships, but were arranged in configurations that suggested a deep understanding of 3-dimensional combat tactics and an alarming willingness to apply overwhelming firepower to any problem that couldn't be solved through polite conversation. The fighter squadrons that swarmed around the larger vessels moved in formations that demonstrated the kind of coordination that came from extensive training and the sort of tactical doctrine that had been refined through practical application rather than theoretical speculation. But it was the fleet's command structure that revealed the true scope of what the hegemony was facing. These weren't the scattered independent vessels of an exploration fleet, or the loose confederation of ships that characterized most primitive military organizations. This was an integrated battle group that moved with the precision of a single vast organism. Communication arrays linked every vessel in a quantum-encrypted network that operated at speeds approaching the theoretical limits of information transfer. Tactical coordination was seamless, response times were measured in microseconds, and the overall command authority was centralized in a way that suggested a level of military sophistication that the hegemony's analysts had confidently declared impossible for a species as individualistic as human. The flagship identified itself with a transmission that was broadcast on all frequencies simultaneously, using communication protocols that were somehow both perfectly standard and completely unprecedented. The message was brief, professional, and delivered in the kind of tone that military personnel throughout the galaxy had learned to recognize as the sound of someone who was about to ruin your entire day through the application of superior firepower and tactical expertise. Attention Hegemony Central Command. This is Admiral Elena Vasquez commanding the 1st Expeditionary Fleet of the Terran Sovereignty. We are operating under Article 7 of the Galactic Warfare Conventions, specifically the provisions regarding the protection of sovereign territorial rights and the response to systematic aggression against civilian population. We are requesting immediate conference with your highest military authority to discuss the transfer of administrative control over the territories currently designated as hegemony expansion zones. The transmission was accompanied by tactical data that made it abundantly clear that this wasn't actually a request. The fleet composition analysis that followed revealed the full scope of humanity's technological advancement. The energy readings indicated that human power generation had advanced to the point where individual vessels were operating reactor systems that exceeded the total output of most hegemony industrial complexes. The weapon signatures suggested directed energy systems that could deliver precisely controlled destruction across distances measured in astronomical units. The defensive capabilities included shield generators that appeared to be operating on principles that the hegemony's physics departments had classified as theoretically possible but practically unachievable for at least another millennium. Most disturbing of all was the tactical doctrine that the fleet represented. These weren't the weapons of a species that fought wars for emotional reasons, or abandoned long-term projects in favor of immediate gratification. This was the military expression of a civilization that had spent centuries studying the art of warfare with the same methodical precision that they had once applied to filing scout reports. Every system, every weapon, every tactical formation demonstrated an understanding of strategic theory that was both comprehensive and ruthlessly practical. The flagship itself was a revelation that rewrote everything the hegemony thought it knew about human technological capability. The vessel's energy signature indicated power systems that shouldn't exist, propulsion technology that violated established principles of faster-than-light physics, and defensive capabilities that suggested the kind of advanced materials science that required either centuries of focused research or access to manufacturing techniques that were at least 3 technological generations beyond anything in the hegemony's arsenal. But it was the ship's name that provided the final terrifying piece of the puzzle. UES, Inevitable Consequence. It was painted across the hull in letters that were clearly visible to the naked eye, accompanied by a ship's crest that depicted a stylized representation of entropy itself, the universal constant that eventually consumed everything, no matter how advanced, or confident, or certain of its own superiority. The emergency sessions that convened across hegemony space, following the fleet's arrival, were exercises in the kind of panic that comes from suddenly realizing that all of your fundamental assumptions about reality have been not just wrong, but catastrophically, laughably, professionally wrong. The species that had been filing reports under quaint bipedal mammals with delusions of competence had apparently spent the past 8 centuries quietly developing the kind of military technology that made the hegemony's most advanced warships look like decorative lawn ornaments. The files were hastily reviewed, the assessments were frantically recalculated, and the strategic implications were analyzed with the kind of desperate thoroughness that comes from knowing that someone's career was about to end very badly and hoping it wouldn't be yours. The conclusion that emerged from this frantic reappraisal was both simple and terrifying. Humanity had not just caught up to the hegemony's level of technological advancement, they had apparently surpassed it by a margin that suggested either divine intervention or the kind of focused systematic research and development program that could only be sustained by a species that was considerably more patient and considerably more dangerous than anyone had given them credit for. The bureaucrats who had spent centuries filing papers about human limitations now found themselves frantically searching through databases for any record of human capabilities that might have been overlooked, misclassified, or simply ignored because it didn't fit the comfortable narrative they had constructed about the natural order of galactic civilization. What they discovered was a pattern of systematic underestimation that stretched back centuries and had apparently provided humanity with the perfect cover for the largest military buildup in galactic history. The hegemony of advanced species had achieved something remarkable in the annals of galactic civilization. They had successfully dismissed the most dangerous species in known space as harmless primitives right up until the moment that species arrived at their doorstep with enough firepower to rewrite the political map of 17-star system. It was the kind of achievement that would have looked impressive on official reports, if there had been anyone left with the authority to file them. The boarding of Hegemony's Central Command Station Alpha Prime was conducted with the kind of professional courtesy that somehow managed to be more terrifying than outright hostility. The human forces that secured the facility moved through the corridors with the fluid precision of a military organization that had clearly spent considerable time studying the architectural principles of hegemony construction, and had developed tactical doctrines specifically designed to neutralize the defensive advantages that the station's builders had assumed were impregnable. The security systems that had been designed to repel boarding actions by conventional military forces proved to be roughly as effective as harsh language against an opponent who had apparently spent decades developing countermeasures for every defensive technology in the hegemony's arsenal. Blast doors that should have sealed automatically instead opened with suspicious promptness. Defensive turrets that should have engaged hostile targets instead remained dormant, their targeting systems mysteriously unable to identify the human soldiers as threats. Emergency containment protocols activated exactly as designed, except that they seemed to be containing the station's defenders rather than the boarders. It was the kind of systematic neutralization that suggested either incredible luck or the sort of detailed intelligence gathering that could only come from having spent centuries quietly observing, cataloging and preparing countermeasures for every aspect of hegemony military doctrine. The smart money was on the latter, particularly given that human scout reports had apparently included rather more technical detail than anyone had bothered to actually read. The human troops themselves moved with the kind of casual competence that military professionals throughout the galaxy had learned to recognize as the hallmark of veterans who had seen enough actual combat to know the difference between theoretical tactics and practical violence. Their equipment was advanced enough to make the hegemony's best military technology look like museum pieces, but it was worn with the kind of functional familiarity that suggested these weren't ceremonial weapons being displayed for intimidation purposes. These were working tools in the hands of people who knew exactly how to use them. But it was their commander who provided the final definitive answer to the question of just how badly the hegemony had miscalculated the nature of human civilization. Admiral Elena Vasquez entered the station's primary command center with the bearing of someone who had spent her entire career preparing for exactly this moment. Her uniform was pristine, her insignia were precisely arranged, and her expression carried the particular combination of professional courtesy and absolute certainty that had made human diplomats so remarkably effective at negotiations that other species mistakenly assumed were about trade agreements rather than surrender terms. But it was what she wore on her head that made every alien present understand, with the kind of crystalline clarity that comes from suddenly having all the pieces of a puzzle fall into place, exactly how completely they had misunderstood the nature of human ambition. The crown was not ornate in the way that alien civilizations typically understood regalia. It wasn't encrusted with precious stones or formed from exotic metals or designed to project holographic displays that demonstrated the wearer's technological sophistication. Instead, it was a simple circlet of what appeared to be ordinary metal, marked with symbols that were clearly human in origin, but bore a disturbing resemblance to the mathematical constants that governed faster-than-light physics and quantum field manipulation. It was the crown of a conqueror, but not the kind of conqueror that the hegemony had been expecting. This wasn't the ceremonial headpiece of a primitive warlord who had achieved dominance through superior brutality. This was the functional insignia of a military commander who had systematically dismantled the defensive capabilities of 17 star systems through the application of superior strategy, advanced, and the kind of long-term planning that could only be sustained by a civilization that had spent centuries preparing for exactly this confrontation. Honorable representatives of the hegemony of advanced species, Admiral Vasquez began, her voice carrying the kind of professional courtesy that made it clear she was observing the diplomatic formalities primarily as a matter of personal preference, rather than political necessity. I trust you've had an opportunity to review the territorial transfer documents that were transmitted to your various governmental bodies approximately 6 hours ago. The documents in question had been comprehensive, legally precise, and utterly devastating in their implication. They detailed the systematic neutralization of hegemony military assets across 43 star systems, the establishment of human administrative control over critical infrastructure networks, and the implementation of new governmental frameworks that would ensure the smooth transition from hegemony rule to what the documents diplomatically referred to as more effective management protocol. The legal justification for these actions was founded on Article 7 of the Galactic Warfare Conventions, specifically the provisions that authorized military intervention in cases where established governments had demonstrated systematic negligence in the protection of civilian population. The evidence supporting this justification was exhaustive, well documented, and included detailed records of hegemony colonial policies that had apparently been considered acceptable when applied to primitive species, but looked considerably less defensible when evaluated by the standards of civilization that had spent centuries developing rather more sophisticated approaches to interstellar governance. The transition period has been designed to minimize disruption to existing civilian populations, the Admiral continued,
consulting a datapad that contained what appeared to be implementation schedules for the complete reorganization of galactic civilization. Essential services will continue operating under temporary human administration, while new governmental structures are established. Trade routes will remain open, though they will now operate under revised security protocols that should significantly reduce the incidence of piracy, territorial disputes, and what your own records classify as regrettable administrative oversight. The assembled hegemony officials absorbed this information with the kind of stunned silence that comes from suddenly realizing that what you had assumed was a negotiation was actually a briefing on decisions that had already been implemented. The humans hadn't come to demand surrender. They had come to inform the hegemony that surrender had already occurred, and that the paperwork was currently being processed through the appropriate channel. Your species' contributions to galactic civilization have been substantial, Admiral Vasquez continued, and will continue to be valued under the new administrative framework. However, certain structural inefficiencies in your governmental systems have been identified and will be addressed through the implementation of more effective management protocols. The transition teams are already in position and will begin operations immediately following this brief. The most disturbing aspect of this revelation was not the scope of human military capabilities, which had already been demonstrated through the systematic neutralization of the hegemony's defense. It was the casual efficiency with which humanity had apparently been planning this operation for centuries, while maintaining the fiction that they were harmless explorers who needed permission to venture beyond their own star system. The scout reports that the hegemony had dismissed as the amateur efforts of primitive explorers had apparently included detailed intelligence assessments of military installations, strategic resource locations, and governmental vulnerabilities across the entire hegemony sphere of influence. The routine exploration missions had been reconnaissance operations. The scientific surveys had been targeting assessment. The cultural exchange programs had been intelligence-gathering operations, conducted by a species that had apparently developed espionage techniques that made the hegemony's own intelligence services look like enthusiastic amateurs. The humans hadn't just been exploring the galaxy, they had been systematically mapping every aspect of hegemony civilization, while their targets dismissed them as too primitive to understand what they were seeing. It was an intelligence operation of such scope and sophistication that it had remained completely invisible to the targets for over 8 centuries, which suggested either incredible incompetence on the part of hegemony's security services, or incredible competence on the part of human strategic planning. The smart money was on the latter. The former hegemony territories will be administered through a federal system that preserves local autonomy, while ensuring compliance with improved standards for civilian protection, resource allocation, and interstellar law enforcement, Admiral Vasquez explained, as if she were discussing quarterly budget projections, rather than the complete reorganization of galactic civilization. Existing governmental officials who demonstrate competence and adaptability will be retained in appropriate positions. Those who do not will be provided with generous retirement packages and transportation to administrative positions in less critical sectors. The final insult, of course, was that the humans were being perfectly reasonable about the entire process. They weren't demanding tribute, enslaving populations, or implementing the kind of brutal occupation policies that had historically characterized galactic conquest. They were simply replacing an inefficient governmental system with a more effective one, using methods that were both perfectly legal under galactic law and utterly impossible to oppose through conventional military means. The hegemony of advanced species had achieved something remarkable in the annals of galactic civilization. They had successfully managed to be conquered by a species they had dismissed as primitive, using governmental frameworks they had helped to establish. Under legal justifications they had agreed to uphold, all while being treated with the kind of professional courtesy typically reserved for valued colleagues, rather than defeated enemies. Admiral Vasquez concluded her briefing with the kind of diplomatic pleasantries that made it clear the meeting was over and that further discussion would be handled by the appropriate administrative personnel. As she turned to leave, the crown on her head caught the light in a way that made the mathematical symbols etched into its surface briefly visible to the assembled official. The symbols were human numerals, representing the exact number of star systems that had been quietly transferred from hegemony to human control during the past 6 months. 43 systems, precisely as specified in the territorial transfer document, each one documented with the kind of bureaucratic precision that the hegemony had always prided itself on maintaining. The humans had learned to wage war with the same systematic approach they had once applied to filing scout reports, and the results were exactly as devastating as anyone who had actually read those reports might have predicted. The galaxy was no longer bothered by human scout ships requesting permission to explore restricted territories. Instead, it now dealt with human dreadnoughts informing established governments about new territorial arrangements, which was precisely the kind of upgrade in customer service that everyone should have seen coming when they decided to cancel someone's subscription to Peaceful Exploration and accidentally signed them up for the Conquest newsletter instead.